They said to the deers, they opened their home. They said, this half of the estate is yours. This half is ours. And we're going to grow old together. I'm telling you, life gets hard. Some of you guys already know this. Having that kind of deep community and then having Jesus as our best friend is going to make all the difference in the world. All the difference. But let me just move to the last point then, which is loving our neighbor as ourselves, right? And this is the last thing that Jesus says as he sums up the two great commandments that we have. I'm going to go back. Remember Jack Deere here. I'm going to go back. For 10 years, he wrote this book just last year. For 10 years, he couldn't write a single sentence, he says. Why? You're a writer, you're a pastor, you're a speaker. Why haven't you been able to write for 10 years? I'm going to share some news with you that's a bit, as they say nowadays, like trigger warnings. It is a sensitive piece of news. But 11 years ago, before this all started, 11 years ago, one of his two sons, remember the statistic I shared with you guys at the beginning of the talk here? The suicide? Well, his son Scott is a statistic. He took his own life. The way it happened was very tragic. He was watching Fight Club. You guys know that movie? He was over-identifying with the character in the movie where he takes his own life. But then in the character, he comes and resurrects. It's actually a Christ figure in a way, but he resurrects in the movie. Scott took his own life watching that movie, probably on heroin, and of course didn't come back to life. Jack and his wife were praying, literally, son's head blown off, holding his son's head, praying for a resurrection, because he believes in miracles, as do I. Never came back to life. So this is life. This is real life. You can't talk about life without talking about death. So this is Jack Deere, pastor, Christian man, so on and so forth, whose son took his own life in his early 20s. What Jack says in this book, he says, two things I learned in the darkest day of my life. One, and this is where he talks about how God actually, even through the crazy darkness of his life, God still wants us to enjoy him, not to endure him. God is for us, and he spells that out in terms of some financial things that happen in other ways that God really came through. It's really incredible. You should read the book. It's a very easy read. But the second thing he says is, the second most important thing I learned from my own son's death is that deep community is nearly everything to life. Deep, deep community is just about everything there is to life. What does he mean? When his son died, that news traveled in less than a day. They were in Montana, living in Montana at the time. That news traveled somehow all the way to California to some friends. Some friends from California contacted their best friends in Texas, the Deere's best friends in Texas. And the folks in Texas called Jack's wife and said, honey, you got to come down here to Texas. It choked me up too. We're going to fly you. We just bought you a ticket. You guys, you two need to fly down here, and we're going to figure everything out together. It chokes me up because you see a picture of friendship. And so they did. They didn't know. They didn't even know what to. They don't know. What do you do? What do you do when this happens in your life? And some of us may know this firsthand. I have friends who know this firsthand. So they flew down to Texas. They get them from the airport. This couple happens to be a pretty wealthy couple down in Texas. They open up the home, and they said to the Deers, they opened their home. They said, this half of the estate is yours. This half is ours, and we're going to grow old together. I'm telling you, life gets hard. Some of you guys already know this. Having that kind of deep community, and then having Jesus as our best friend, is going to make all the difference in the world. All the difference. Life will get harder. We have to be willing and vulnerable to take on, honestly, here's my orientation to life, as far as I can see it from 44 years of having lived it now. One or two best friends, and I mean godly, there for you to the very end, and one or two mentors, godly, God, not pure perfect, but loves God, loves you, and they're with you to the very end, you'll probably have led a pretty successful life. One or two best friends starting now. One or two best mentors starting now. And I'll give you one last example of this. The second example of deep community and being in loving our neighbors as ourselves happened just this past week in my own life. I can't get into it, but this past week was probably one of the hardest weeks of my life. And I think there's some spiritual warfare. It's because Pastor Kevin invited me here to speak. No, I'm just kidding. But partly true, Pastor Kevin. Partly true. Here's what's also going on. We're getting ready to launch this thing called The Blueprint. It's an online course that we're doing at my nonprofit. It's a pretty big deal. We've worked on it for the past 8 months, and we're just launching it this month. And it's been consuming my life, right? So this past week, I get into this conflict with a relative. Let's just put it that. It's not my wife, but it's a relative, okay? And this conflict was major. And I don't think I've been this upset at an individual, as I was telling my mentor, Osgood, it's like in years, decades, maybe my entire life, I was so upset with this person. And it hasn't resolved yet. It hasn't. It's just real life, okay? Like, that's just true. Like, there's a conflict going on, and I'm speaking to you, but one thing that has resolved is my heart. After 2-3 days of being so upset, somehow my heart got resolved. Here's what happened. Nothing was working. Fine. Nothing was working. I was reading scripture as I do daily. I was praying with my wife as I do daily. I was even texting friends, deep community, I'm going to live this out. And usually words of encouragement, my love language is words, but even that wasn't helping. I was exercising, I was trying to get it out other way. Nothing was working. Except maybe the power of prayer of my wife and many others who I did text. And that's the only way I can explain it. So midway through the week, I think this is Wednesday. It is Wednesday, I remember now. I called him just out of the blue. I was desperate. I just called him. And I said, Oz, here's what's going on. Tell me that I'm over-spiritualizing things. Because I don't like to over-spiritualize. Oh, it's a spiritual warfare. That's why I can't find my keys or something, right? Like, I don't want to over-spiritualize. But it was so timely with the launch of this and the speaking engagement, a couple other things going on in my life. It was so timely. I said, Oz, am I over-spiritualizing or is this real? And the way he said it was just so perfectly timed. But he said, Rich, whenever we get ready to do anything of significance for God, we should expect there to be spiritual battle. And Dr. Guinness would be the kind of person that would know this. I mean, he speaks and writes all over the world, and he's, and so forth, and he faces it too. And so what I'm trying to encourage you with is this, that deep sort of friendship, people who are committed to praying, having a mentor. And so lastly, one of my mentees, that about 2 hours, so after that phone call, by the way, and he prayed for me for a few minutes too, toward the end of the call, and I just began to feel my heart beginning to settle. It was just the middle of the day, it was like 12 o'clock or something, just middle of the day. And my heart finally began to have a sense of peace. For like 2-3 days, I was just so aggravated, but it began to have a sense of peace. And of course, my wife other people were praying. And then I shared this with my mentee. About 2 hours later, I met with one of my students that I mentor. And it's funny, he said to me, you know what I wanted to ask you? And he's not even on Instagram, so he didn't know anything that was really going on about spiritual warfare or whatever. And then he goes, I wanted to ask you today, what do you think about spiritual warfare? And I was like, that's interesting. And I go, why do you ask? And he says, well, because every time I do something, like he's been blogging for us a lot lately and stuff like that. He goes, every time I do it, everyone in our team and everyone else says, he's doing great. He's an excellent writer. He's very young, but he's good. He goes, I don't know why, but I even think, oh, that was a pretty decent piece. And then the next day, I get convinced that it was like the worst thing I ever wrote. And it's not, and even if it is good, is it helping anyone? And he gets into this, and I said, you know what, Charles Spurgeon, every single Monday for decades, some of you guys know this great preacher, he would experience deep melancholy, as he called it, depression, the very day after Sunday. Spiritual warfare is real. By the way, it's not just tables flying all over the room. That's how we think of spiritual warfare. But I actually think, I almost said this, I'll say, Will, I said, what if we just define spiritual not as like ethereal, abstract tables flying, but as anything of or related to the kingdom, whether positive or negative, including conflict with relatives. Could that be counted as spiritual warfare? If the kingdom is all-encompassing, doesn't that matter too to God? And so I just want to encourage you guys with that. I know there's a lot said, and my goodness, it's like a four-part sermon, or four sermons in one, actually. But if I could just encourage you, and that's why I did a handout yesterday. I told Pastor Kevin, I'll just do a little bit of handout. It might help a little bit. But you guys, that's really it. It's the one or two best friends, the one or two mentors. and the gospel, that Jesus is our friend. If you can get that, I believe you'll have a start and an orientation to life. So let me just pray.